That's much easier than at many PRI events. You're all very well trained. You must be in the investment business. Good afternoon. I'm Sally Pipes. I'm president of Pacific Research Institute. I would like to welcome you today to our Dodd-Frank event. Should the capital markets be regulated like banks? We've got a great turnout, and many of you do not know much about Pacific Research Institute, so I thought I would just say a couple of words. PRI is celebrating its 35th anniversary this year here in San Francisco. I've been heading up PRI, I hate to say this, for 23 years, but it's great fun. There's always new things, and we have a wonderful time. We believe in limited government, personal responsibility, and opportunity. At PRI, we work in specific policy areas. My own area of expertise and work is in healthcare. I'm very anti-single payer, anti-more government involvement in healthcare. So that is a big issue. Education reform, environmental reform, and we have fiscal and tax issues, including Art Laffer set up his center at PRI, the Laffer Center at Pacific Research. We're doing some really interesting work. The Pillars of Reaganomics is one of our books. We're developing a dynamic scoring model of the U.S. economy. Art's book with some other authors, The Wealth of State, the Nature and Inquiry into the Wealth of States. So we have a lot going on, and we'd love for you to get more involved, learn more about PRI. Our website is www.pacificresearch.org. Today, I'm delighted to be introducing the moderator of this panel, the Honorable Chris Cox. Chris, of course, as all of you know, was a member of Congress from Orange County for many years. He then became chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now he is president of Bingham Consulting down in Orange County, has a beautiful office next door to a pizza place that we sometimes go to for lunch. But it is beautiful. It's very so. But Chris's major accomplishment is that he is a member of the board of directors of the Pacific Research Institute. So please welcome to the podium the Honorable Chris Cox.
Well, how many people here watched the World Series last night? How about those Royals? I actually know some people here today that are Royals fans, and I will, out of concern for their safety, not disclose their names. There's something else big that's going on in just a few weeks. It isn't just World Series time. We have an election, and in less than 2 weeks, we will learn whether President Obama and his party lose control of the United States Senate. The result of that is going to be very, very important across a number of dimensions. Not least of all, healthcare, as Sally mentioned, and financial regulation. In both of those areas, the Democrats have forced their will on the Congress and the country on a completely partisan basis. Both Obamacare and Dodd-Frank have in common that they were enacted into law in the House of Representatives without a single Republican vote. Both also have in common that they are thousands of pages long and that no legislator of either party in either chamber, the House or the Senate, read the bills before they became law. This sort of one-party legislation is particularly dangerous when the bills are as complex and as prolix and lengthy as Obamacare and Dodd-Frank were, because their operation isn't fully understood until after they go into effect, and the unintended consequences can't be appreciated at the time of enactment. Since Dodd-Frank was signed into law in 2010, we have come to understand just how much was buried in its 2,319 pages. When the 280 new federal rulemakings that the statute requires ultimately are completed, it is estimated that the resulting addition to the length of the Code of Federal Regulations will run to over 20,000 pages. And that will make the collection of the statute and the regs together longer than the full 20-volume edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Currently in the House of Representatives, there is legislation that is under consideration to tame one of Dodd-Frank's most extraordinary creations, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, a 15-member group of 9 regulators within the 15 and chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury. The pending legislation would subject the FSOC, which I think you'll hear everyone on the panel call it today, to the Administrative Procedure Act, a novel concept. The APA, of course, applies to all the extant federal regulators in Washington. So this legislation would put the Financial Stability Oversight Council in that same position like every other regulatory agency in Washington, D.C., so that the regulated community, the markets, the Congress, and even other regulators, because commissioners, for example, of the SEC are not part of FSOC, only the chairman, could know what's going on inside. The impetus for this legislation, in significant part, is a report by the Government Accountability Office that has criticized the FSOC for exercising its sweeping powers in a way that is essentially opaque and arbitrary. The lack of transparency in this super regulatory council is a critical defect, particularly because its decisions can be so consequential. The council has virtually unlimited power and discretion to designate players in any corner of the financial services industry as systemically important financial institutions. The panel today is going to be calling these firms so designated SIFIs. That's the acronyms, systemically important financial institutions. That designation means that the firm involved will be regulated by the Federal Reserve, essentially as it were a bank with potentially enormous competitive consequences. The Dodd-Frank Act itself designates large banks, essentially as too big to fail, those with assets over $50 billion. But it leaves to the discretion of the FSOC what non-bank financial companies to receive that designation. So far, the FSOC has named 3. AIG, the large insurer that was bailed out during the financial crisis, no surprise there. GE Capital and Prudential Financial, and I should add a 4th because very recently MetLife has been selected as a SIFI, and both Pru and MetLife contested their designations. Prudential only at the council level and unsuccessfully. They did not appeal in federal court, as was their right. MetLife, having only recently been named, hasn't yet won or lost at the council level, so we may hear some about that from our panelists. Beyond the insurance industry, the FSOC is looking at the entirety of financial services, including securities broker-dealers, asset managers, and hedge funds. All of these are possible candidates for SIFI designation. What this could mean and how it would work is the subject of our panel today. And so with that, I want to introduce our panelists and invite you all up here while I brag on you a little bit. And let me start with our highest ranking current government official, SEC Commissioner Dan Gallagher. Dan has served on the Securities and Exchange Commission since 2011, and he's been an energetic defender in that role of both investors and markets. Prior to being appointed by President Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate, he was the co-director of the SEC's Division of Trading and Markets, an exceptionally influential position in the wake of the financial crisis when he was responsible for leading the SEC's role in the liquidation of Lehman. He is by profession and expert in broker-dealer regulation, having been a lawyer in private practice with Davis Polk and Wardwell and the general counsel of Fiserv Securities. He is a graduate of Georgetown University and earned his JD magna cum laude from Catholic University. Over the last decade, it was my privilege to serve on the Securities and Exchange Commission with our next panelist, Paul Atkins, who was appointed by President Bush in 2002. Former Commissioner Atkins has a long history with the agency, having served on the staff of two chairmen of the SEC, Richard Breeden and Arthur Levitt. He too has been a securities lawyer in private practice at Davis Polk, and today he heads his own firm, Potomac Global Partners, where he assists clients with regulatory compliance, risk management, public affairs, independent reviews, litigation support, and strategy. Paul is a graduate of Wofford College and earned his JD from Vanderbilt University. Joanne Medero is managing director at BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager with over $4.5 trillion in assets under management. Ms. Medero is responsible for overseeing the firm's government relations and public policy. She had been global head of government relations and public policy and general counsel for Barclays Global Investors when that firm merged with BlackRock in 2009. She too has been a lawyer in private practice, having been a partner at Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, specializing in derivatives and market regulation, and she too has been a high-ranking federal regulator, having been the general counsel of the CFTC. In a particularly happy coincidence, Joanne and I served in the Reagan White House at the same time when Joanne was responsible for legal and financial affairs at the White House Office of Presidential Personnel. She's an honors graduate of St. Lawrence University and earned her JD from George Washington University. Our final panelist, Brian Cartwright, has had several careers, any one of which would be impressive on its own. After graduating from Yale in 1967, he earned a PhD in physics from the University of Chicago. During the 1970s, he was a research physicist at the University of California Space Science Laboratory in Berkeley and published a number of articles in scholarly journals on high-energy particle physics. With his head in the stars and his feet on the ground, he pulled a mid-career switch, enrolled at Harvard Law School, and like Barack Obama, became president of the Harvard Law Review. And surpassing even our president, he also earned the Sears Prize for the highest grades in his class. After clerking on the U.S. Supreme Court, he became a partner at Latham & Watkins, where the two of us met. At Latham, Brian was a member of the firm's executive committee and global chair of the Public Company Representation Practice Group. Throughout my chairmanship, he served as general counsel of the SEC. As you can see, our panelists are superbly qualified to tackle this topic, and so I want immediately to get started. Dan, why don't you open it up for us with your initial observations on how the FSOC fits into this overall picture and why it matters to everybody in this room.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks for having me here. It's good to get out of Washington. Very, very good to get out of Washington these days. And one thing I always have to do to, when we get these introductions, for folks who don't know the statutory construct of the commission, in 1934, when the commission was created, they mandated, and it continues today, that no more than 3 of the members of the commission can be of the same political party as the president. So if you're going to be mystified later at the things I say, if you really think that President Obama picked me, he didn't have much of a choice. And so anyway, and I just do need to give my standard disclaimer that my views are my own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the commission, and it's quite a shame. So, that being said, we're talking about FSOC, and it's hard to think about how to approach FSOC because we could spend all of our time just talking about its construct, its opacity. I think to take a step back and to think, how did FSOC arise? The Financial Stability Oversight Council, the systemic risk regulator for the United States. Well, in the crisis, there was a view, and in a view that I share actually in part, that there was a lack of information sharing amongst regulators. There wasn't data being presented across regulatory agencies. The communication lines weren't exactly working tremendously well, and Chris and I saw this up close and personal in the fall of 2008. And so the thought was, how can we improve that? The mechanism in place at the time for the financial services regulators was the President's Working Group, which, an important group, not a statutorily mandated group, no information sharing requirements, no privacy protections, and one that worked, quite frankly, pretty well, and I think it actually worked decently during the crisis, but was imperfect with respect to information sharing and coordination. And I would say to you that I think that a lot of the lack of coordination, the lack of information sharing to the extent it was available, caused some very bad policy decisions during the crisis. That there weren't meaningful decisions being made about bailouts and other things. And so the idea of a systemic risk regulator, I think, is a decent one to debate. What we got is not what anybody wanted. So in the Dodd-Frank process, as Chris noted, we had a single-party piece of legislation. I say this time and again in my speeches, where when it was determined that this was not going to be bipartisan, and when you think about bipartisanship, Sarbanes-Oxley, the last major piece of legislation responsive to a crisis, hugely bipartisan, almost completely bipartisan, very regulatory, very burdensome on the markets, but there was buy-in throughout Congress and then at the SEC that had to implement Sarbanes-Oxley. Those rules were done, and it was not a very politicized process. Well, Dodd-Frank, turns out, was a single-party piece of legislation. When certain special interest groups and legislators figured out it was a runaway freight train, they dumped into it all of their wish list items, and I could go on and on about some of those. My favorite, of course, is the mandated disclosure of the use of conflict minerals in the Congo by U.S. public companies, because we all know that that caused the financial crisis. But you don't have to worry about that anymore. That tantalum won't take down Lehman ever again, and because we've written that rule. So, but Dodd-Frank, in approaching systemic risk in its Title I, decided to create a systemic risk regulator. And if folks remember, in the fall of 2008, with the AIG bailout, there was huge public backlash, rightfully so, against the bailout of AIG. And then what some people forget, all the while in 2008 leading through December, we all assumed that the Fed, in whatever this financial reform legislation would be created, would be deemed to be the systemic risk regulator. The Fed, with its access to taxpayer dollars, was able to come in like a white knight and bail out the entities that it did a horrible job of overseeing in the years leading into the crisis. And so they were going to win the prize of the systemic risk regulator, and it seemed like it was simply preordained. But then they paid out the bonuses to the AIG executives, right, in January of 2009. And there was a popular revolt, and the pressure was placed on Congress, most specifically on Chris Dodd. And next thing you know, there was, because the Fed had approved those payments to the AIG executives, the question arose, why and how could they be a systemic risk regulator? In swoops Sheila Bair, the chairman of the FDIC, who says it should not be a single regulator, it should be a council. And one of my former colleagues, Mary Shapiro, I think in her only act of recalcitrance with respect to the Obama administration, said, I agree, it should be a council. And lo and behold, what we got eventually through a lot of negotiation was the FSOC. So Chris mentioned the construct of the FSOC. One thing I want you to think about as we talk more about it is that, again, taking a step back, there are two ways to view our markets, simple ways. There are banking markets and non-bank markets, the capital markets. In the United States, 80% of the financing for our economy comes from the capital markets, 20% from the banking markets. It's the exact opposite in Europe. And that's why there are so many problems right now with the banks in Europe. And so when I talk about capital markets regulation, I'm talking about non-bank regulation. And when we talk about that, the SEC is the premier regulator, I would say, certainly in the United States, but maybe globally, of capital markets. There was a view created of capital markets regulation in the crisis that it was inept, that it was insufficient. And I believe that to be because capital markets regulators, like the SEC, can't bail entities out, can't bail people out, and can't bail products out. We're appropriated agencies, we're overseen by Congress, we have no line into the Treasury or other taxpayer funds. So when our entities, as happened with Lehman Brothers, take excessive risk when they can't meet their obligations, they fail, and our regime is meant to deal with failure. I submit to you, I think that's what Main Street America wants. And if anything, what we should have been doing for the last 5 years is perfecting failure, thinking about what happened in Lehman and in other failures and saying, how do we do that better? How do we amend the bankruptcy code? How do we amend our rules to get at failure? The bank regulators have a different view, where we might act like morticians, they act like ER doctors. They want to keep everybody alive, right? And if doing so, they open up strange facilities, they do things like TARP, they do all these other things to keep the entities alive. And that, I again would submit to you, is what Main Street does not want, and that therefore the backlash against bailouts. The FSOC is dominated by bank regulators. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, which is a supranational group in Basel. It too is dominated by bank regulators and central banks. So this mindset permeates everything FSOC does. So when we talk about these designations and everything else, I think Chris is right to say it can perpetuate too big to fail. They didn't designate GE Capital as a SIFI or sci-fi, as Paul will call it later. Sorry to take your thunder on that. They didn't designate GE Capital as a SIFI just to let it fail down the road. And there's this imprimatur put on it now. It would be an abject embarrassment for the bank regulators to let it fail. And of course, with the Fed as their regulator, all sorts of nifty little windows and tricks can open up to make sure an otherwise failing institution can stay alive. And so I've had famously some battles at the commission with respect to the money market mutual fund rulemaking with FSOC. I would submit one. Paul might differ with me on that a little bit. But in fighting this notion that we should treat capital markets products like bank products and regulate them like banks and make sure they don't fail. That was a famous battle we had in 2012. I think it's important for folks to understand what this FSOC is, how it might impact you, regardless of whether or not you're in the financial services industry. And that's why I think it's great that we're having this discussion today. So with that, I'll pass it on to Paul to pick up.
And Paul, that was a great kickoff, Dan, and I think gives us a little better sense of what the structure is of the FSOC, how it fits into the big picture. This MetLife designation, which is the most recent one, is of course a designation of an insurance company. And one of the issues around SIFI designation is who's going to do the regulating and will they be any good at it? With insurance, obviously we don't have expertise at the federal level in regulating insurance because that's all under McCarran-Ferguson done at the state level. There is one person under Dodd-Frank who's designated as the insurance expert, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate for his insurance expertise. And each time the FSOC has designated an insurance company, he's dissented. So help us understand a little bit, not just the insurance piece of this, but also, with all the rest of these asset managers and hedge fund managers and so on. I mean, is this going to be functional regulation if we do it at the Fed, and how is that all going to work?
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. I mean, it's quite a mess, and so a lot of this, of course, is powered by some of it is kind of turfy bit because the Fed is the one, as Chris was saying, that sits around this table, which is the FSOC with these 10 regulators, and it's headed by the Treasury Secretary. So now you have this political, I mean, they're all political appointees, but who is really part of the administration now, basically having a veto power in this group over these nominally independent regulatory agencies, which have, of course, some Republicans on them, and then, of course, the majority Democrats at all these agencies. But still, you have both voices. But at the FSOC, all of that gets drowned out. So, for example, when Prudential was designated as a sci-fi, and I'll get to why I pronounce that in a minute, Mary Jo White was recused because she had perhaps worked for Prudential in some way when she was in private practice before she became an SEC chairman. So the SEC had no voice around the table when they designated because the people sitting around this table are doing it in their personal capacity. And so it all comes back to, who is, like Chris was saying, who is going to oversee these various companies or other sorts of things that are designated, and in what way. And like Chris mentioned, this fellow, Roy Woodall, who was appointed by Obama as the person around this table who's supposed to look after insurance and knows something about insurance business, and he was the Kentucky state insurance regulator, and insurance industry is regulated by the states and not by the federal government. So Congress in its wisdom said we better put somebody around this table who knows something about insurance. Well, he excoriated the FSOC for doing what it did with respect to Prudential, saying basically they didn't know what they were doing. There was no process that was transparent and open, and he said there's no way for the Fed to be able to oversee Prudential, which is what it comes down to. If one of these firms is designated by the FSOC, then the Fed comes in and says, you need to do X, Y, and Z according to our rules.
So can I just interject, because I happen to have exactly
his
what he
words.
said
Okay, I
here,
was
and I
looking
just want
for
to
it.
read a little bit from his dissent, because you're absolutely right. It wasn't just a dissent, it was an excoriation. The underlying analysis, and this is the insurance expert, the only one on the FSOC, the underlying analysis utilizes scenarios that are antithetical to a fundamental and seasoned understanding of the business of insurance, the insurance regulatory environment, and the state insurance company resolution and guarantee fund systems. As presented, therefore, the analysis makes it impossible for me to concur, because the grounds for the final determination are simply not reasonable or defensible and provide no basis for me to concur.
Right. So, I mean, that's a pretty big slam, and so, good for him for doing it. And so now, as Chris mentioned, next up in the insurance bit is MetLife, and MetLife has really been fighting this in all sorts of ways in the press and on the Hill and whatnot. And interestingly, Roy Woodall voted present in a good Obama way when the FSOC decided to designate MetLife. But he did that, I think, as a very interesting way, because what happens in the Star Chamber type of thing is that the staff of the FSOC and really the Fed and Treasury go up and present to the members and say, we think that this company, because of all these different things, ought to be designated as a sci-fi. And so then the wise men and women sitting around the table nod and say, okay, we agree with you, we'll vote for that. But the opposite side isn't presented. And only then if the if the company says, hey, wait a minute, why am I being picked on here? I disagree with this, and this is why, then does that firm get its to present its other side. And so I think that's why Roy Woodall voted present, because let's hope that he votes no. But a lot of all of this is underlying. It's no surprise to you all in California, but it really is an anti-market sentiment. So we see it in Obamacare, we saw it in Dodd-Frank, and it's basically the government knows best, and we can get a group of smart people sitting around the room, and if they get enough information and they think big thoughts and peer into their crystal ball, they can make markets stable. And that's in fact what sets up the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Title I of Dodd-Frank is titled Financial Stability. So it's basically what I like to call stability über alles. And so if you look at Hayek's last book, it was called Fatal Conceit, and he addressed this problem head on. And he decried the drive in government, in Washington especially, about, and you see it at the Fed and everywhere else, if we just get enough information, we can outsmart the markets and we can make them stable. So if you want stability, to Dan's point, go to a bank where it's too big to fail and the taxpayers will back it up and make it stable. But the capital markets are powered by humans, and humans have a lot of virtues, but they also have a lot of vices, the 7 deadly sins. Among those are greed and envy and fear and everything else. But that's what drives the markets. And so if you're going to have this group then designate things as systemically important, so it's a SIFI, systemically important financial institution. You have Hi-Fi, H-I-F-I, Wi-Fi, W-I-F-I. This is sci-fi, so let me, as a son of the South, teach you all here in California how to pronounce sci-fi. And but in all senses of that word, it is science fiction that that this group can think that it can then go in and through this designation process and adding on this overlay of Fed of Fed regulation, then tame the marketplace, and you have the Fed with 0% interest rates, and you know when they start raising them, the market's going to get unstable. So that's why they're now casting their eyes beyond insurance towards asset management. So that's what I hope we talk about here.
Well, what a perfect segue to Joanne, because you just mentioned asset management.
Right.
Joanne, part of my job here as moderator of the panel is to be provocative, so let me see if I can provoke you by asking you to start out by listing the top 3 reasons that it would make sense for the asset management industry to be regulated by the Federal Reserve as if it were a bank.
Time's
You're
up.
right.
Boy, if it maybe I could do a Letterman routine. Right? No, I want to talk a little bit about. So we've talked a little bit about the FSOC and how it's set up and what it's supposed to do, and essentially, Congress believes and the FSOC believes that it can, as Paul said, get enough information, oversee the right institutions, and prevent systemic risk, the next crisis. And when I think about this, when you talk about asset management and systemic risk, the issue is no particular problem has really been identified that is really part of the asset management business. And I think, as others have alluded to, people are coming from a bank mindset. Banks act as principals. Banks take your money in as deposits short term. They lend it out long term. They manage everything on their balance sheet. Asset managers are agents. Your investments are held separate from their balance sheet. They act on your behalf. In fact, capital movements in and out of asset classes are not, despite what certain people believe in Washington, are not the decisions of an asset manager. The asset owner makes that decision, whether they want to be in high yield debt or they don't want to be in emerging markets anymore. That is not something a large asset manager, as large as we are, but we have company, not close by company, but we have company in large in terms of, say, Vanguard or Fidelity. And we don't decide, get up one morning and say, gee, we're going to get rid of all our emerging market debt. Our clients may get up some morning and say, please sell all my emerging market debt. And that's why we're kind of puzzled by the efforts of the FSOC and the Financial Stability Board of targeting asset managers as entities that are themselves systemically important. So we've started a bit of a thing of, we'll call it myth and reality. So one myth is that asset managers control flows across asset classes, which we don't. That we control flows out of particular asset classes, emerging markets, bank loans, whatever. Again, those are client decisions. Now, we've had an interesting experiment, I'll call it, and these guys are going down to Southern California, so they can use my experiment test there too. One of the other things that we've told is a great risk to the market, the capital markets, is that if a manager experiences a reputational event or organizational turnover, this will lead to massive client redemptions against the entire platform, and those asset sales will significantly disrupt the market. Well, actually, clients are smarter than that. They generally focus on particular products. If there's a star manager, they may decide to move their assets away from that star manager's product, the fund that he managed. A lot of people keep their assets themselves in separate accounts, so they don't fire a manager, and when they fire a manager, I should say, they don't sell their assets. they simply call the custodian and say, BlackRock can't manage my money anymore. I've given all the instructions to Fidelity. You take your instructions in the future from Fidelity. So there's no big dumping of assets in the market. And then, frankly, assets don't move as quickly as regulators would, or bank regulators. We don't have that run phenomenon that there's a presumption that bank regulators have, because people actually are thoughtful. Your pension plan, you take your time to pick your new manager, and whatever. So now, when we were on the speaker circuit this summer and we were saying these things, people didn't believe us. So now we actually have a real life example, because we have seen out of a large manager in Southern California about 30 to 40 billion of assets move out of their funds in the last, say, since from the end of September to about now. And yes, there's been market volatility, but if you look closely, the market volatility actually is not in the asset classes that this manager was in. So I'm sure the FSOC and the FSB will come up with another theory as to why asset managers are systemic, and we will continue to try to debunk those. I have a bit of a commercial. If you really want to dig into all the details on some of these things, and with numbers and who owns what assets and whatever, we have a lot of material on the BlackRock website, and you just say BlackRock public policy in any search engine and it'll come up, and you can dig into your heart's content. So I hope people read it, because it's taking up a lot of my life. The more readers, the better. So.
Brian, you are well known as a fabulous lawyer. There's some legal questions lurking around this that you might touch on in your opening presentation. It's been mentioned that someone who is designated as a SIFI can appeal to the council. And if they don't get the result they want from the council, they can go to court. What's wrong with that? Why doesn't that work? Second, I wonder if you could maybe mention a bit further the FSB, because that's come up here, and what is the risk that the FSOC is simply patterning the FSB, and why would that be an issue? And then lastly, since you're at the end here, we got to load onto you all the issues that we haven't got to yet. Competitively, what does this mean? And for people in this room who undoubtedly represent lots of different industries and fields of endeavor and so on, why does it matter to them if we get it wrong in Washington?
Well, let me go in reverse order. We talk about sort of the competitive landscape, and I think it makes sense if we're going to do that to take a view over a lot of decades, let's say the last 4 or 5 decades, and see what's been going on. And of course, the large pattern is that we've moved from a bank-dominant world to a world in which the capital markets play a much greater role. As Stan pointed out at the beginning, 80%, not sure quite where we got that number, but it sounds right to me, 80% of the fundraising for enterprise in the country is coming from the capital markets rather than from banks. And you can name lots of other transitions away from banks over the last half century or so. High yield debt, replacing in many instances what would have been term loans from a bank. Money market mutual funds acting as something somewhat similar to deposit accounts at banks. Pooled mortgage security vehicles playing a very significant role in the market for funding of mortgages for houses and other kinds of buildings and property that used to be the exclusive presence of banks. So we're seeing the capital markets with the advantages that they have of transparency, many participants, in most instances larger capital markets, very high degrees of liquidity, and so forth. beginning to move the economy away from banks in some measure. Obviously, banks are still extraordinarily important, and into something else. So I think George Orwell, probably lots of other people, have said that if you can control the language, then you can control thought, and if you can control thought, you can control what happens in the world. And so the banking folks refer to this as shadow banking. And it's a wonderful use of language. I always say, figure out what you're going to call it, and then if you can get that lodged in everybody's mind, you'll be way ahead of the game. So they've got shadow banking in people's minds, and that works, a couple of ways for the bank regulators. First, it identifies something that's, a little bit shadowy, dark, and we need to do something about it. And it perhaps provides an opportunity for the bank regulators to move to where the action is these days, which is a little bit away from banks, which they're actually fairly good at. Plenty of banking institutions that they regulated very highly failed in the last crisis, so they're not perfect at it, but they're pretty good at it. But they'd like to be in the...
Name me an asset manager that failed.
Yeah, right, exactly. So they'd like to be where the action is, which is shadow banking. I mean, I could refer to the banks as shadow capital markets.
Well, the biggest shadow bank of them all is the Federal Reserve,
Yeah,
of course.
and the shadow capital markets, I mean, this is dangerous stuff, guys, really. I mean, what do they do? Okay, they borrow money from Ma and Pa, and they tell those people, we'll give it back to you whenever you want it. And then they loan out multiples of the amount that they've borrowed in long-term assets. So they have a huge maturity mismatch. I mean, that's sort of the first rule of financial management, is not to have maturity mismatches. So naturally, they're unstable. And you can go on the internet. It's fun. There are all kinds of screeds out there where people are saying this should be illegal, it's criminal, it's obviously. Now, we all know that banks are very important. I like banks. I don't mean to be saying that banks aren't appropriate in our economy, but they have real problems. And the asset managers and let's say registered mutual funds in this country don't have those problems. For example, leverage. Banks have typically about a factor of 10 leverage. That is, their assets and liabilities are about 10 times the size of their capital. There's an SEC rule that a registered mutual fund can't have a leverage ratio more than 1.5. That's the legal maximum. And if you look at, and we'll talk about the Financial Stability Board, they've identified 14 globally significant financial institutions potentially. They're all U.S. mutual funds. And the average leverage ratio is 1.04. And a number of those on the list have leverage of 1, that is none, or 1.01. So mutual funds do not leverage up. They're providers of capital, not consumers of capital. It's very hard to see how they're going to convey risk elsewhere. And I should probably stop here. I could get on a roll on this, and it would be 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. But there is so little in common with banks, and yet you have regulators who have their whole careers. That's how they think. This is, I don't blame them for it, really, but they think of everything as a bank. You've got, a hammer, everything's a nail. And they want to bring the same tools to bear on these other institutions that are working extraordinarily well without their help. So,
Well, and also aren't not regulated.
Yeah.
They're just not regulated by them.
by them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're registered mutual funds in this country, I would argue, are extraordinarily highly regulated, and the people who have to do compliance for them would tell you for sure that they are. It's not that they're not regulated; they're regulated by people who actually understand that business.
But one thing
last point, I just don't want to lose this before we get into free for all with the panel, which everybody wants to hear, and that is this standard for overturning a decision by the FSOC. In Dodd-Frank, the standard is arbitrary and capricious? What, from a legal standpoint, what does that
Yeah,
mean?
I mean,
how
there
likely
are
we going to win
there
on
are
that
huge
standard?
due process issues and other constitutional issues in all of this, and I think that's a less important issue. I mean, maybe it's important if you're a sci-fi or sci-fi who's having a very difficult time. And it's disturbing to me because more broadly, I see us in the United States chipping away at due process in countless different areas across the board. But this whole scheme has been devised to make it essentially impossible to overturn, as a practical matter, the action of the FSOC.
Paul.
Yeah, well, I was going to say two things. And on that one, you all should know that there is at least one lawsuit that is challenging the constitutionality of this particular provision of Dodd-Frank, Title I. It's called the State National Bank of Big Spring, Texas versus FSOC. And so this fellow...
It's really hard to get somebody who's regulated to sue the regulator on something they really care about like this.
So the fellow, Jim Purcell, who's the CEO of the State National Bank of Big Spring, Texas, which is a small national bank in Texas, brought this lawsuit. And in the first instance, it's now the jurisdictional phase, whether or not the people bringing it have standing. And basically the judge, I think, told Big Spring Bank, well, you know, if this is going to cost you money, you're a regulated entity, you have to pay money anyway because you're regulated, it's kind of too bad. So anyway, this is being appealed up to the D.C. Circuit, and it will be battled out in the future. So that part's being challenged, and among the bases for challenging it is this particular provision that Chris just talked about, which basically purports to tell a judge you cannot look at the substance of what the FSOC does. You can only look at whether or not they were basically drunk. You know, if they acted arbitrarily and capriciously, which is an extremely low bar to hurdle. So anyway, we'll see how that plays out. But the other thing I wanted to mention is we've talked about regulation and you know, of mutual funds or asset managers or insurance companies, but I think we ought to talk about what that means to you all, because it means dollars and cents, of course. And just like you know, any regulatory cost is ultimately borne by the consumers of the product, either through a higher price or through lower choice in the market. That's what's going to happen here. And the way that if something is designated as a sci-fi, that means that the Fed can come in and impose capital requirements. So what does that mean? So that means if you have a money market mutual fund and they put an 8 to 12% capital charge on that, that means you won't be able, out of your $100 that you've put into your money market mutual fund or whatever other mutual fund, you won't have access to 8 to 12 bucks of that. They could put in all sorts of other things to keep you from having access or having your money work for you. But then even more scary, if they, as they go into the asset management industry, whether if they designate a particular fund or if they say the entire activity of asset management is systemically important, then we as the Fed can come in and basically intervene. So say we're undoing our 0% interest rate policy and starting to raise rates, the market starts to go crazy. So how do we stop the market from going crazy? And remember, we don't like markets in the first place, and government knows best. So what we're going to do is tell either your particular asset manager, and if you have a BlackRock fund or a Fidelity fund or whatever, we're going to say, you know what, we're going to ask you not to sell out, even though Mr. X is asking you to liquidate his fund. We think you need to take one for the team, and you just need to hold on until we tell you that it's okay to sell your particular fund.
So
I'll
tell you what that means to me as an investor. I mean, I won't tell you which ones, but invested in some of the mutual funds on the list of 14 that the Financial Stability Board has designated as potentially global sci-fis. And as soon as there's a capital charge, I mean, S&P 500 index funds, there's a lot of those, and expense ratio matters. I'm moving to somebody who isn't so designated. So, I mean, I think that this whole system can't work because there are so many substitutes for the funds that might be affected that people would simply move, and I would do it overnight. I mean, that's, not interested in having, my investment messed with in this way.
I think this discussion about capital is really instructive, and I've actually given a couple speeches this year on this specific point. I won't bore you because it gets pretty boring pretty quick. But capital, bank capital, is one of the tools, as Brian mentioned, in the bank regulator's toolkit. And when they think they see something that should be a bank, walks like a bank, talks like a bank, should be a bank, it's a shadow bank, what they want to do, first and foremost, is inflict a capital requirement upon it. Paul talked about an 8 to 12% capital buffer for money funds. This was part of the existential battle we had in 2012. And we weren't even talking about 8 to 12%. That would be true capital in any sort of safety and soundness perspective. That would buffer against risks that might keep the entity alive in a time of true stress. What the Fed wanted to do with money funds back in 2011, 2012 was to inflict a capital buffer of 1 to 2%, 100 to 200 basis points. So when I came in as a new commissioner, our chairman gave a speech the week after I showed up announcing this new initiative that we're going to regulate money funds. That's how I learned about it in the press. And so immediately I had half of Boston coming in to meet with me to argue why we shouldn't do such things. And
Pittsburgh.
And Pittsburgh, yes, lots of Pittsburgh. But we had one firm in particular saying, okay, if you're going to do this, we'll take 50 basis points. We can do 50 basis points worth of capital. It'll take us 7 years to accrue it because unlike a bank, right, where are you going to get the money? You're getting your money as a management company out of the fees. You're not going to go in and steal the corpus of their principal. So it would have to accrue over 7 years. So after 7 years, this particular fund family would have about $2 to $3 billion worth of so-called capital standing in front of $500 billion, right? So in a 2008 scenario, what do you guys think would happen? Nothing. It's not capital in any way that we understand capital. And what I try to talk to folks about and have them understand, it goes back to this ER doctor versus mortician thing. Our capital regime at the SEC, to the extent we have it, it's mostly in the broker-dealer side, is geared towards failure. When you fail, we want to make sure there's enough money there to keep the lights on so that we can give customers their funds back, and then you're done. That's the regime. On the bank side, it's very different. Keep that buffer between the taxpayer dollars and the institution. And these two philosophies really can't mix. There's no true bridge between them as much as the bank regulators are trying to march us down that path. The Roy Woodall quote that Chris read, it goes on in his dissent to touch this very same point. Bank-like capital in the insurance industry makes no sense. They too, like asset managers, are just big pools of assets. This notion of run risk in the insurance industry is absolutely laughable because you have to die. So it's kind of hard to run when you're dead. And these notions of why we need to treat things like banks start to go out the window, and capital is first and foremost, I think, the canary in the coal mine. So in meeting with Fed officials in 2011, soon after I got there, I said, well, now we have one fund family who tells me they'll give in to 50 basis points, and they said, well, that's not enough. We probably need 100 basis points. So I said, even at 100, what's that going to do for 2008? They said, nothing. I said, so why are we doing this? This is supposed to be about 2008. I said, well, it could help smooth things out on an intraday basis. It could do this, it could do that. But it would not solve 2008. And what our economists later found when they studied this at the request of 3 of us, a majority of the commission, not the chairman, is that not only would it do nothing in the face of 2008, it would effectively kill that product. So Paul's point about investor choice is paramount. If you required 100, 200 basis points worth of capital in the funds that they were trying to get at, the prime money market funds, you turn them into synthetic treasury funds, which are very riskless, but you get the proportionate return. And we already have treasury funds, so we don't need more of those. So what's this exercise all about? It's about dominion, it's about jurisdiction, and it, again, is about using the only thing that you have in your toolkit. But when you do that, you have to get at the philosophies, and the philosophies of regulation in the capital markets are very different, as I said at the front end of this talk, than those in the bank markets.
Yeah, let me jump on that and raise it to an even higher level of abstraction, in addition to the sort of oil and water relative features of bank regulation and, for example, money market regulation, securities regulation generally, CFTC regulation, there's also, at the congressional level, two different camps about what regulation can and should do. And in the wake of the financial crisis, it's really all come into sharp relief. One critique of the regulatory system that was in place at the time of the financial crisis is that no individual regulator saw the whole picture, and therefore bad things happened. The opposite view is that there was functional regulation, but there were regulatory gaps. So if you have the former view, then what you're going to want to do is make sure that some omniscient regulator in Washington finally gets to see everything. So we had these MOUs that we started executing 2006, 7, 8, and so on, to start sharing information among the CFTC, the SEC, the Fed, and so on. And if you take that idea, which is collaborative among functional regulators, and you run with it all the way to its logical extreme, you end up with what the Fed is now seeking to become, which is the one sole source view of all information, to compare it to Homeland Security, which it was supposed to be. The Department of Homeland Security, remember, it was going to solve that problem. The all-source integrator of, in DHS's case, all intelligence relating to the domestic terrorist threat. And in the financial sector, we're going to have an all-source integrator that looks at everything across the financial markets. And I'll just say, in my view, the fallacy that's embedded in that is that no people can be wise enough or smart enough and all-seeing enough to know what the hell's going on in an economy as large as ours, and really a globally interconnected economy. And so your best bet actually is to push all that information out into the marketplace and let billions of people have a look at it in real time. The SEC's always been really good at that. So that's my 2 cents to throw in. But I don't know what you think of that as SEC or CFTC people.
Yeah, well, I completely agree, and it goes back to Friedrich von Hayek's original book Fatal Conceit, where he really did say that he saw it coming and said, "This can't be where it's impossible for human beings to process all that and then act effectively better than the marketplace with billions and billions of transactions taking account and it finding its way that way." So I guess that's it. And the one thing you mentioned too, it's kind of funny. It brings back when you talked about MOUs. So believe it or not, I think this is always interesting for taxpayers to hear. But actually, in Washington, you have to have memoranda of understanding between these groups that work for the taxpayer, of course, these various regulatory groups, because otherwise they won't play in the same sandbox together, and they get very mad. So you have to negotiate. And I remember when I was a commissioner with Chris, just trying to come up with a memorandum of understanding with the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, where you could see another one of my counterparts, another commissioner over there, Walt Lucan, who's a great guy. We saw no reason why couldn't we get this done pretty quickly, but to get the two staffs together, like in my office, you could have cut the atmosphere with a knife because they really literally hated each other so much. But that's really the problem with this FSOC and trying to bridge all that. I mean, I think it's a fool's errand.
Well, and one of the things you missed too, right, that underlies all this discussion is one of the things Dodd-Frank set out to do was to address one of the narratives, which Dodd-Frank is premised on a narrative of Wall Street greed and regulatory failures. Nothing about failed federal housing policy, nothing about loose monetary policy. And if you were one of the congressmen who was involved in failed federal housing policy, you'd write the statute to excuse yourself too, I guess. And this notion of regulatory failures is very interesting. And in that narrative, they say there were too many agencies, too many redundancies, too many gaps and the like, as Chris said. So they set out to rationalize the regulatory framework. So they got rid of one agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, and created at least 3 more. It depends on how you count. And then they cobbled together 9 or 10 of them into the FSOC and tried to get them to go off and work together.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing I would say along this same line is, if you listen to the rhetoric coming from the Fed and also coming from central bankers who are part of the Financial Stability Council, when it comes to asset managers as systemically important, the question is asked to them, so what do you intend to do as a policy matter if you were to designate either funds or managers? And the answer comes back kind of, well, we're going to tailor our regulation. Okay, so what regulation are you tailoring? Well, we're going to tailor things. And actually, Chair White gave an interesting speech soon after she experienced, I think, her early FSOC experience. And she said, well, you know, I don't like to vote for things until I know what the remedy's going to be. And I hope that she stays that course, because that's the other thing that people should listen to is the Fed wants this power, whether it's the insurance companies or the asset managers or GE Finance, which is really a finance company, but they have yet, in fact, PRU's been designated for over a year, they have yet to tell PRU, much less the public, what they intend to do as a policy matter with this authority. And it's kind of like, trust me, we're the Fed, you know, we did a great job in the financial crisis, and we'll do another great job.
Well, the important thing is to get the jurisdiction. You know, once you've got the jurisdiction, then, you know,
Well, and actually,
you
to
can
be
get
fair-
around
to be
to
fair-
actually
to be
regulating.
Fair, the Fed did go out and hire 2 insurance experts about 9 months after they got PRU as a designated entity.
I mean, the point that Paul made about interagency rivalry, I was just, it caused, and negotiating moves, memorandum of understanding, it just reminded me of an anecdote which I've been thinking about. Can I share this? And I've decided why not. But in negotiations with another major federal agency, where the staffs had been arguing over turf for decades, you know, fighting each other in Congress, fighting each other and all. I mean, they as Paul said, they really did develop deep personal enmity. And so a very senior guy in my agency, and he knew I was in favor of, you know, getting to yes, you know, making an agreement, figuring out something that was appropriate, you know, for all sides. And so I was a big threat. And he came to me and he said this in all seriousness. There wasn't the slightest hint of you know, hyperbole from his perspective in it. He said, Brian, you don't understand. You haven't been dealing with these people for 20 years like I have. They're evil. And that is a direct quote.
All right, well, we are at the time now where we can open it up for Q&A. And I think we've got some juices flowing here. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just 2 quick questions. Can you comment on the impact of Glass-Steagall in blurring the lines between banks and capital markets? And then also the impact of the low interest rate environment on exacerbating the problems that we have now.
Anyone in particular? Well, I think, so Glass-Steagall is, of course, the 30s era legislation that cleanly divided commercial banking and investment banking, which is capital markets activity. Over the years, that distinction had been chipped away at a staff level at the Fed, whereby banks, commercial banks, starting with JP Morgan in the late 80s, were allowed more and more to partake in capital markets activities. Open trading desks in London, eventually in New York, start trading securities, holding securities, and it got bigger and bigger until the late 90s when Graham Leach Bliley came along and got rid of whatever vestige was left of Glass-Steagall. There is this remaining notion, there was at least in Dodd-Frank, that Graham Leach Bliley, this horrible deregulatory thing, got rid of Glass-Steagall, this wonderful thing from the 30s. A lot of folks in Washington think the 30s were just terrific. And this caused the crisis. And if you are really a student of the history of the evolution of Glass-Steagall, you'll know that that just wasn't the case. It sure made some things easier by way of creating these massive conglomerates like Citi and others. You know, they might not have reached their full size had it not been for for GLB, but the Glass-Steagall distinction and this sort of waxing nostalgic for the days of the 30s, I find to be silly. And then now folks directly attribute that to too big to fail, which is a continuing concern of many of us. The monetary policy question, exacerbating which situation? The bank versus capital markets issue? Well, people are seeking yield. They're rational market participants. All of you are, right? You'd rather make 0.5 than 0, which is really your choice these days. And so, as a regulator, to sit back as a capital markets regulator, to watch our investors in the capital markets go into junk bonds because they get nothing in a savings account, certainly nothing in their mattress. That's not exactly a good thing for us to watch. And again, though, if we spend all of our time, which I do a lot of, I did it this morning at 7 a.m. your time, so I felt the pain of the West Coast time change for the first time. If I promulgate Dodd-Frank rules all the time, and that's based on a false narrative of the crisis, if it had nothing to do with loose monetary policy or federal housing policy, then folks get this false sense of security that we're actually not only addressing the last crisis, but through mechanisms like FSOC, we can figure out what the next one is. And I think that's pure folly. And just one more point on this whole FSOC process is they sit there and infatuate, which they've been doing for years, on designating specific entities as systemically important, and whatever that comes with it, benefits or burdens, an equal mix. They've not been, as far as I can tell, and I'm an outsider to this, which is a point I don't know if we accentuated enough, despite the fact that our chairman's there. I'm an outsider. I have no vote. I have no say. And that's like, I don't know what happens in these meetings. They're not focusing on these day-to-day issues of what I would think to be systemic risk. In a 0% interest rate environment, for example, we've had for the last 5 years record issuances of corporate debt, over $1 trillion each year. This year, we're already at $1 trillion. Makes perfect sense. Market participants are rational. Lock in those low rates. Finance your business. Well, we now have $11.2 trillion outstanding in corporate debt, if you include asset-backed securities. When the interest rates finally go up, which hopefully I think will be next year, when there is sell-side pressure, where are the buyers going to be? The dealer inventories, the big banks that used to hold all this corporate debt on their balance sheets, are down 85% since 2008 because of Dodd-Frank, because of Basel III, because of some prudent risk management too. But they're not there to provide that liquidity. What's going to happen? And one of Chris's favorite subjects from his terrific Harvard speech when he was chairman, one thing I've learned is that one of the major holders of corporate debt in the United States are sovereign wealth funds, right? They're being custodied and held here by sovereign wealth funds. It's not just the retail impact, which I think is a huge issue. A quarter or more of corporate debt is held, actually up to 45%, either through an asset manager or directly by retail. But on the institutional side, it's not just pension funds and it's not just the big asset managers. It's sovereign wealth funds too, which may not act like rational market participants in a time of stress.
This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you all. And how are the banks and wirehouses regulated? Are the wirehouses considered banks or asset managers and markets?
The traditional term wirehouse is a broker-dealer term, which is an SEC-regulated entity that's not a bank, despite what the Fed may think. I'll tell you, I think that distinction was incredibly blurred to the detriment of good policy and taxpayers through the creation of bank holding companies for two entities, in particular, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Folks forget there had been severe stress placed on those firms in September of 2008. It looked like there was going to be another shotgun marriage put together by the government with a commercial bank and those entities. Over one weekend at the end of September, it was decided instead to convert them into bank holding company status, which would be a signal to the markets that they're secure, they're not going to fail because they're now bank holding companies. They have access to windows and other things that they didn't. They're really broker-dealer holding companies, but they're called bank holding companies. And a lot of the policy that's coming out of the Fed, the FSOC, the FSB right now, is geared towards those two entities, specifically some others a little more generally. Right, so let's rein in broker-dealers because we're scared of these big broker-dealers. Merrill Lynch is now inside Bank of America, you're right. Barclays, holds Lehman. Let's rein in broker dealers because a lot of them now, the big ones, are in bank holding companies, and we're worried about that, and that's driving bad policy. But they are not banks.
Before I came over here for lunch, I caught a piece, and I may be wrong, but I believe it said that Fannie and Freddie want to lower the down payment on homes to 3% to stimulate housing so more lower income people can buy homes. Can you tell us what
You have a
drugs
problem with that?
Can you tell us what drugs they're using?
I wish I knew. They won't give me any of them. That's the problem. I got to take just an initial cut at this. I know Paul wants to go because this was the purpose of my 7 o'clock rulemaking today. So Section 941 of Dodd-Frank, that's Title 9, Section 41 of about 16 titles in 2,319 pages. Section 941 is the so-called credit risk retention provision. It says that when you securitize, asset-backed securities, that unless a carve-out applies, unless an exemption applies, you have to hold back 5%. You have to have skin in the game if you're the securitizer, and that will make you do more diligence. That will make you, unlike what we saw happen in the years leading up to the crisis, put better quality assets in these pooled vehicles. The carve-out of interest in today's rulemaking was, and this is geared towards mortgage securities, if you are originating and then securitizing so-called qualified residential mortgages, QRM. If you originate those, then you don't have to hold back 5%. So we had to define what is a QRM. And the proposal in 2011 that came out, first of all, I don't think the government should be mandating risk management, so let me just take a step back and say I think 941 is folly. But if you're going to engage in it, and you have to define QRM, and if it's a carve-out from a risk management standard, you'd think you'd want to codify some prudent lending standards. So in 2011, they proposed a 20% down payment, some high loan-to-value ratios, some things that would otherwise have been deemed just prudent lending standards. I know they're the ones that apply to me, and that I always comply with a couple mortgages I've had. The pushback, bipartisan on the Hill, cronyistic across the board from community activists to lobbyists for the home builders was so intense that last year we re-proposed the rule. QRM would now be defined, believe it or not, I don't want to get too complicated here, but as the same thing as QM, qualified mortgage, which is a definition overseen by one of the new entities in Dodd-Frank, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which Paul could talk about for a long, long time and will. So basically we outsourced a definition to a group where it's held by the agency is overseen by one person, unaccountable to Congress, that's within the Fed, and their definition says no money down. No money down. So our QRM that was made final today, the federal government has said you are making qualified mortgages even if there is zero down. And on a 3-2 vote of the commission, you can guess where I came out on it. We were one of the 6 agencies that codified this rule. And this honestly, as I said, this is probably of the 9 3-2 dissents I've had to endure in 3 years as a commissioner. This one hurts the most because I really do think this was the cause of the financial crisis. And the SEC is an agency that's sort of on the edges of some of these systemic risk issues. This was our chance to play the hero and say, no, we're not going along with this. The mandate says we all have to do this at once. If we don't do it, then no one does it. And we can never put something in the Code of Federal Regulations that says a qualified mortgage, it can be a $0 down mortgage. And guess what? They succumbed to pressure. The president called them all into the White House a month ago to impart upon them how important it was. Mel Watt, the new head of the FHFA, replaced Ed DeMarco, who was a very, very diligent bureaucrat, a guy who'd worked up and was very tough with Fannie and Freddie. He didn't want to see this standard, but he's been replaced by Mel Watt. That is the new law of the land as of 7 a.m. Pacific time this morning.
But the good news is that now you can just take out your cell phone and call 1-888 no-down. You can have a
But to your
lunch,
point,
too.
at the same time we did this rulemaking, and believe me, it was planned this way. Mel Watt and the FHFA announced last week that Fannie and Freddie will now be loosening their standards to provide more credit. They only control right now 80% of the mortgage market. If you add Ginnie Mae's, I learned this from one of my colleagues in his dissent today, you get to 99+% of the mortgage markets. There is no private mortgage market in the United States right now, and we codified it today. Yeah, sorry on that optimistic note.
Well, and just like, I mean, so we're hurtling down again for a repeat of '08, of course, but just like leading up to that, between Fannie and Freddie, they held far and away the majority of the Alt-A and the subprime mortgages at the time. So that, is a repeat of it, obviously.
And if you look in 2,300 pages of Dodd-Frank, go in and do a word search, find Fannie and Freddie. If you find it, tell me, because I've been looking. I don't see it anywhere.
You mentioned earlier that you had hoped rates would go up next year. Isn't the whole market and the system painted into a corner now where rates can never go up? They'll always find a reason for them not to go up.
Yeah.
And there's enough. MIT professor Andrew McAfee wrote Second Machine Age about all the deflationary pressures as a result of technology and other things that are legitimately, I think, going to keep a lid on a lot of the traditional inflationary measures so that it's lower forever, basically.
Yeah, I think, like many, I'd hoped this year we would see the first interest rate rise. I guess we're supposed to be optimistic that quantitative easing is over, right? So that our government not paying $80 billion per month to buy bonds is reason for celebration these days. What we saw when Bernanke was still chairman last summer and mentioned the potential for an interest rate rise at some point in the future. That's basically what he said. The markets dropped 700 points that day. The stock markets, big swoon, scared the heck out of a lot of these folks in the administration. So that caused them, I think, to walk so far away from potentially raising rates in a prudent manner in the near term. And then, of course, Bernanke leaving and Yellen being much more dovish. I don't expect it anytime soon. They're indicating next summer. Until and unless we get to that point, we'll have this irrational activity in the markets that we discussed earlier, where folks are seeking out yield, taking on risk they might not understand, and a distortion in the markets that shouldn't exist because the government shouldn't be there.
From a fiscal policy standpoint, just looking at the federal government's finances, even at today's interest rates, interest on the debt is the #1 entitlement program. And it's a lot of taxation. It represents almost the entirety of individual income taxes. And we just take that money and light it on fire, and it pays the interest carry on our currently extant debt, which is growing rather rapidly every year, as you know. If interest rates climb, then very quickly, doesn't take much, you find that at today's level of spending, you could account for the entirety of the federal budget with just interest on the debt. Within parameters that we've experienced, you don't have to go back to the 70s even to have those kinds of rates that will get you there. So a lot of costs to raising those rates, and I think you're right, the Fed's going to be looking for any way not to do that. But they don't control interest rates entirely.
Right.
Markets still count.
Yeah, just a question. We see that the European banks are going to have a stress test. What do we know about the European banks and their real versus the U.S. banks in terms of real strength, real capital?
One thing we know is that the financing is directly inverse, is what I told you, 80%. Capital markets here, 20. It's the exact opposite in Europe, which we haven't talked enough about FSB, but it's a related point. I think the total holdings of assets by European banks is about 200% of European GDP, whereas in the U.S. it's about 80%, which is a much more healthy figure. There's a lot of concern in Europe that when the Basel III standards get fully implemented, which will happen over the next couple years, the European banks will have to shed what so-called Tier 3 assets, the lower quality assets, because under Basel III they can't afford the charges that would be associated with those. So ironically, one of the things that's happening in Europe now, and I just got back from a trip there at the end of July, is that they're suddenly talking about the need to create capital markets and grow their capital markets, because they realize that when these banks shed these Tier 3 assets, who's going to buy it? Nobody. They need to securitize it and sell it off to investors in tranches of securities, and they don't have securitization markets. And then who's going to replace that lending? Right? The banks aren't going to sell their tier 3 loans and then make new ones. So therefore, the need for capital markets, which I find
we've pointed
fascinating.
out this irony.
Yeah. Well, and it's just fascinating because I sat there at HM Treasury. I sat there at the PRA, which is the Prudential Regulatory Authority in London. I sat there in Dublin and said, this is great. They kept telling me how wonderful this new EU initiative is to grow their capital markets. And I said, so how is it then that you go off to Basel and you sit at the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, and you talk and plot about shadow banking, which is capital markets financing, and you talk about how to introduce frictions into those markets, but over here you're telling me you need to grow them. No one had an answer to that question across the board.
We may have time for one really comprehensive wrap-up question.
Put you on the spot.
Hearing none, I want to ask you all to offer a big round of applause for this outstanding panel. Ryan, Joanne, Paul, Dan, thanks very much.
Oh, great.